Is it possible to plan and execute a $150 million heist from the biggest bank in the Western world, get caught, and then not serve a day in prison? This is going to be the most dangerous video a CFO has ever made. This is a deep dive into the third biggest bank robbery of all time, yet one that's been almost buried from any media coverage. I'm going to answer that in this video. But even better, this video is done by the very person who, while the crime was being investigated and in courts, I was brought in to manage JPMorgan Sydney and the very department where cash transactions of this sort are all processed through. I'll bring an inside viewpoint and some analysis that you've never heard anywhere else about it. If you thought Ocean's 11 was clever and full of twists and turns, then just wait. This is a truly unique, true crime story never told before in this level of detail, starring characters like Teflon Tony, Mr. Pink, Fat Bastard, Swiss bank accounts, a floating casino, operations across 4 countries, $150 million going missing, and a whole lot more craziness. Yeah, I bet you've never heard about it until now. So let's dive in. And first, let me give you some important context. My name's David, I'm a CFO, and this video is partly with that financial mindset of wanting to understand how this crime was planned, how it went down, whether it could have really ever worked, and if it could have been done today as well. And stay tuned for later in this video when I go over the 11 dumb mistakes the crime gang made that got them caught. So the first place to start is understanding the gang, because it's a big one and we need to know the roles of each of the member and the backgrounds of each of these men. So let's start with the leader of the crime, which is Tony Vincent. We'll call him the architect of this, but his nickname is actually Teflon Tony. Tony's a 63-year-old and he's the leader of one of Sydney's most notorious crime gangs. Vincent is a part owner of a strip club in Market Street, Sydney called Lady Jane's, and that's where he's going to base his operations from. The criminal Robert Clee described it as a club where hard men drink and that 80% of all the customers are criminals. Now by 2003, Vincent is already under investigation by the Strike Force West Bank from police for large-scale drug trafficking, and we'll come back to that one later. Next up is Dallas Fitzgerald. He's 22. He's the son of Felix Lyle, a well-known underworld figure, and would ultimately become the Sydney chapter Hell's Angels boss. Felix gets Dallas a job as a bouncer and debt collector for his friend Tony Vincent, and Dallas would go on to become one of Vincent's most trusted lieutenants. And he becomes also known as Mr. Pink, which is based on the character from the movie Reservoir Dogs. Now Dallas has also got a black belt in karate, and later on he'd also join the Hells Angels. Next is Greg Burscher. Now he's going to become the inside man. He's 31 years old. He works at JPMorgan as an assistant treasurer in the Treasury area, and he's actually the one that would be processing large transfers out of these superannuation accounts. Now he becomes connected because he's family friends with a guy called Gary Peterson, and we'll come back to him in a minute. Burscher gave Vincent something very valuable. He gave him the inside knowledge about how all the JPMorgan cash transfers worked, the internal procedures, the security protocols, and the transfer authorization processes. But interestingly, Burscher is also related to a police officer and also someone who works for the Director of Public Prosecutions. Next in the group is Jamie Vincent. He's the son of Tony Vincent and is also going to be one of the trusted people in the group. And his age, from what I can tell, was either 33 or 40 at this point in time. Next up, Barry Osborne. He's 42 years old. He's a Telstra lineman with 20 plus years experience in telecommunications, and he knows Sydney's phone system very well, and he has access to phone exchanges, which is going to be critical. Next is Ernst Hafnagel. He's 52 years old, originally from Germany. He's an established underworld figure, but interestingly, the backstory is his older sister runs one of Australia's most well-known modelling agencies, and she was brought to the brink of bankruptcy back in 1990 when her original agency was the victim of embezzlement by 2 staff who tried to make off with $8 million. But that seems to have not put off Ernst whatsoever. Next is Alexander Roisman, a 48-year-old invalid pensioner with rumoured KGB connections. He also has a friendship with another guy we're going to talk about in a minute, Leon Kuras, and he's listed as Leon's next of kin in a lease agreement for an office in Piedmont. And Roisman may be an important connection back to Tony Vincent here for other members in the group. Next is Matthew Theriault. He's somewhere around about 37 or just under. He's a close person to Tony Vincent, and he's going to be involved in setting up the Greek bank account. Then we move to Jian Hua Chen. He's around about 37, and he's a well-known gambler in Sydney's Star Casino. Next is Jian Ping Wong. He's around 37 as well. He's a former casino public relations officer at a casino in Macau before coming to Sydney to work as a cook. That connection is going to become really important later on. And he's somewhat of a professional gambler as well, and he potentially knows Alexander Roisman from what I can tell. Then we move to Richard Kurland. He's around 56 years old. He's a former South African solicitor turned into an insurance fraud investigator. He's been living in Australia for 20 years, and he's an Australian citizen by that time. He's also set up intellectual property and anti-counterfeiting services when he's been in Australia. He lived in Lura in the Blue Mountains, but he's got a dormant Swiss bank account, and he's friends with Leon Kuris, and that's going to become important later on. Now we move to Gary Peterson. He's around 50 years old. His nickname is Fat Bastard by his criminal mates. He's the former secretary manager of the Newtown RSL Club, and he's the long-term family friend of the Bourchier family. But he's also close to Tony Vincent. He's going to become the glue in this. Now let's get back to Leon Kuris. He's around 48 years old. He's friends with Richard Kurland, as I mentioned. He's also potentially friends with Alexander Roisman. He's unemployed, and he's got a lot of crazy schemes for making money fast. He's also central to organising some of the overseas bank accounts that they're going to attempt to launder the money through. Then we move to the last member, Arkady Drizner. Age unknown. He's possibly a Russian-born Israeli who's living in South Africa. He's suspected of international drug trafficking. He's on the Interpol's intelligence reports, but he hasn't been caught yet. Now, if all this is sounding fascinating, I've got a link down in the description below to a PDF document I've made about the whole story, and it's a fascinating read. So if you want to see more about the JPMorgan heist, see the link down below. Now that we've covered the members, we've got to cover one important factor. There's the circle of trust we've got to consider. And we all know what the circle of trust is. But it's really important to know here because there's members who will know more information about the whole setup of the crime than others. There's people in here who are brought in to do one specific task only, and that won't even know more than one other person in this whole 14-member group. But there are others that will know the whole layout and that will know all the members and what their roles are in the crime. So I've made up this graphic which sort of breaks down how I interpreted what the circle of trust looks like. So everyone inside the pink area, they're in the circle of trust, and they have high levels of information about how the crime's going to go down and are potentially the beneficiaries of the largest amount that they're going to get receiving from it. But then those that are outside the circle of trust in the bottom half have got one specific task. They may only know the next person up in the line from them and know nothing more about who else is involved. And they're also potentially on the line only for a relatively small payday here. So they're risking a lot to gain a very small amount themselves. So leading on from that, we've now got to consider the setup of the whole heist. So the crime gang themselves are going to try to execute this in the simplest possible way they can. They're also going to try to involve the minimal number of people they can, but they're going to have several trusted people on the inside that will know the full plan to help them execute, but also keep others with minimal knowledge about it. And that can also then keep the lion's share of the funds into the smallest number of people. Or you can throw out all of that and just say, well, let's just go big or go home, come up with the most audacious plan you can, try to have the biggest payday you can, and to possibly have as many loose ends left on the table as possible. And let's see which one they chose here. So the initiation point of the crime is really that you've got Gary Peterson knowing someone in the Bourchier family who works at JPMorgan. And somehow they've now come to the realization that this guy works in a role where he is seeing and part of the trail of authorizing tens of millions of dollars of daily payments outside of the bank to third parties. And then at some stage they've said, how can we divert some of those funds to ourselves? That knowledge has taken from Gary Peterson to Tony Vincent, and they've come up with a plan of how can they make one of these transfers out and then get the money themselves. And the earliest time frame we know is in May 2003, there's phone calls that have been intercepted between Arkady Drizner and Tony Vincent. Now, what Tony Vincent doesn't know at this point in time is that for the whole of 2003, he and potentially members of his crime gang are under phone surveillance relating to other drug charges. So the whole time, police unknowingly are recording all the set-up phone calls for the bank heist. But the police at this point don't know it, and obviously Tony Vincent doesn't know it either. But as part of that, the Arkady Drizner is on the phone recorded with a conversation to Tony Vincent in around May 2003. Then somewhere in 2003, Greg Bourchier provides documents from JPMorgan with detailed instructions, transfer procedures, authorization requirements, internal phone directories, and handwritten notes. And he provides that to someone in Tony Vincent's crew. Possibly around mid-2003, Leon Kuras convinces Richard Kurland to let him use his dormant Swiss bank account. And he's going to say that he's got some large amount of money coming through from an investor and he needed to get access to it. Kurland at that point in time may have assumed that this is going to amount to nothing though. In September 2003, Arkady Drizner though travels to Sydney and he's got those Treasury faxes that came from Greg Bourchier in his possession. And he's got other notes relating to the heist and international money transfers. Now this is discovered by Australian custom officers acting on intelligence who searched his luggage at Sydney Airport. But they didn't know at that point in time what all these JPMorgan faxes and related information is relating to, but they took copies of it all. And then there's record of Tony Vincent and his crew meeting at his restaurant and nightclub Lady Jane's at various times through the rest of 2003. Next, they set up 2 bank accounts with HSBC Hong Kong. The first is Hong Kong Power Limited, which is specifically linked to a gambling cruise operation, whilst the second account is linked to a Macau casino. And that's set up with the help of Jian Hua Chen. Next, the Greek bank account is also organised with the help of Matthew Theriault. And then late 2003, police are investigating Tony Vincent and his 3 sons, Jamie, Seamus and Tony Jr. for drug supply, and they continue recording all their phone calls. So by December 2003, we've now got the final coordination of all the heist activities. We've got contacts in Hong Kong, Switzerland, Greece, back to Sydney, and we've also got the phone intercepts from the police where there's a lot of urgent conversations around the timing of things, the account details and contingency plans. And as a risk person, I love a good contingency plan. And then on the 23rd of December, we have Jian Ping Wong, who leaves Australia headed for Hong Kong, and he's most likely also with Alexander Roisman. Now here we've got to keep in mind there's 2 facets for this operation to go down. Firstly, you've got to get the money out of JPMorgan. Secondly, you've got to get the money back to the organisers, and that's part of the money laundering plan. So you've built the team around these 2 separate operations, and there's specialists for each of them, but minimal crossover between the 2 halves. So let's recap. The insider is the JPMorgan Treasury staff, and they've got a target identified via the conversations with him of the Commonwealth Superannuation Scheme, CSS. Now this has got $5.5 billion in it and around 47,000 members of that. It's a superannuation scheme in Australia of retirement funds. The means of how they're going to do this crime is they're going to have a fake instruction that is looking and appearing to come from the trustee for CSS, which is State Street Global Advisors, SSGA, and we'll talk about them a lot more later on. This fake instruction is going to go back to JP Morgan and going to tell them to send money from the CSS out to another third party. But the most devious part of the plan is they're going to do it on Christmas Eve. And the timing here is so critical because it's going to rely on the fact that there's going to be lax controls in place. There's going to be an urgency that staff want to get out of there for the day, because often in banks like this, people do leave a lot earlier on Christmas Eve, and they're not going to do all of the regular checks that they might do on a particular day. But even more importantly, there's going to be 5 days pass until staff are going to return back to the office and then have an opportunity to see that there's a horrendous fraud that's taken place. And then in sending those funds out, they're going to use 4 accounts to send it across into all overseas accounts. They're going to need to try to clean those funds somehow. And there's possibly a second layer of accounts where money's going to be transferred to after passing through the first one to try to clear that account and to make it into clear funds they can then send back to Australia at some point. So here's the rundown of the playbook they're going to try to do on Christmas Eve. Barry Osborne is going to hack into the Telstra exchange to access SSGA's secure fax line. They're going to send a fraudulent fax appearing to come from State Street to request the transfer of funds from the CSS account. Ernst Hufnagel is then going to make a confirmation call posing as someone from SSGA, a guy called Craig Slater. And then Greg Burscher, the inside guy, is going to process that transfer without conducting the required callback verification that's normally needed for amounts of this size. The money's then going to be sent to these 4 overseas accounts, and then by the time we've got the Christmas break, we've got public holidays, and JPMorgan will not know that these accounts have been drawn into a massive overdraft until the 5th day later. So on the surface, it seems brilliant. Let's see if it works. And if you like these sort of breakdowns from the perspective of a CFO, then consider subscribing to my channel for more entertaining stories like this and further deep insights about how to become a CFO without wasting years off your career. So let's now talk about the timeline of the heist and all the things that went on the 24th of December. And we're going to go into this minute by minute. So let's start on 12:47. Barry Osborne, the Telstra guy, uses his Telstra swipe card to access the Daly Street Exchange, which is called the Daly 2 Telephone Exchange, and goes through a side entrance. Now this is literally around the corner from the JPMorgan offices, which at the time were at 255 George Street, Sydney. Now Osborne's got with him Ernst Hufnagel. He doesn't really need to be there, but you've got someone that's connected to the inside team who's always with someone from the outside team. So Hufnagel was in a secure Telstra facility with Osborne. They've gone through the side entrance because the main entrance has got renovations. Whether or not they knew that there were just happened to be renovations going on at that point in time, it's hard to know. At that time though, if they would have gone through the main entrance, they may not have had to actually put his swipe card through, and there wouldn't have been any record of them going into there. And that again is going to come back later on as something which may have tripped them up. So by 12:50, Osborne is using his knowledge and he's now connecting into the State Street Global Advisors fax line so that they can plug in something to send a fax directly from the exchange that will appear to come through from the SSGA fax line. And we're not talking about the cybercrime of today. They're actually going hardwired connection into a telecommunication line at this stage. They're not in the JPMorgan systems. They're coming out from the intermediary between State Street and JPMorgan itself. So I presume they've got some sort of portable fax machine or something they're using. By 1:15, the fax transmission of the first page has now started to come through to JPMorgan. And they've used the letterhead for SSGA. They've used the correct account numbers. They've used all the correct language and terminology that you'd see on a fax instruction. And the fax is now for an amount of $149,968,626 to be sent from the CSS account to these 4 overseas accounts. But then the first thing goes wrong. The next 4 pages of the fax do not go through. So however they were trying to do it, first page was successful, the next 4 pages haven't gone through. And at this stage, Osborne is probably panicking. And in the next 5 minutes, what he decides to do is to switch over to a generic line that they can use to send the fax from. So now this is not coming from the secured line that JPMorgan should recognize as belonging to SSGA. But Osborne and Hufnagel take their chance. They send the next 4 pages through and they are sent through successfully. So by 1:30, JPMorgan now have a 5-page instruction that's been sent through, supposedly from SSGA. The first page has the right fax number on it. The next 4 have a different fax number on it. But keep in mind, it's Christmas Eve. There's usually low staff numbers working on that day. People want to get out of there quickly. And even though they see that it's come from a different fax number, they ignore it. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is an enormously large transfer to come through. So even though you've got transactions coming through for tens of millions of dollars on a daily basis, sending $150 million out on an account like this on one transaction, especially in a time frame like this, it's got red flags written all over it. This is not a usual type of transaction, and in some ways it should be a very obvious thing that you'd want to spend enormous amounts of care to go and verify. So JPMorgan's received the facts, but they're also waiting for a phone call. They're waiting for a phone call that's coming through from SSGA to confirm the instructions that's just been faxed across. And that's to stop just anyone just faxing off anything to them saying send the money here, send the money there. So then Ernst Hufnagel makes that phone call from the SSGA hacked line that Osborne has set up. And then he has that phone call back to JP Morgan. And guess who answers on the other end of the line? That's right, the inside man, Greg Burscher. Here's how that conversation goes. Hufnagel says, "How you going, mate? Not too bad. I'm calling to confirm the transfer instructions we just faxed over." Burscher, "Yeah, I've got them here, 149.9 million to the 4 accounts." Hufnagel, "That's right. Everything look correct on your end?" Burscher, "All looks good. I'll process them now." So JP Morgan's procedures at this point in time are it's greater than $10 million and someone needs to call back SSGA on a secured line which is recorded and to see that this transaction is genuine. And that's going to independently verify the transfer and prevent the very type of fraud that Tony Vincent has tried to get away with here. But it doesn't happen. Greg Burscher simply processes the transaction and never makes that phone call. So now we've got fake documents that have been acted on and we haven't done a callback. And also keep in mind that all the callbacks are on recorded lines. And potentially Greg Burscher doesn't want to do that call. One, because obviously you can't call back SSGA because they're going to say the instruction was fake. But also Greg Burscher doesn't want to be on a recorded line with evidence that he's then involved in the crime. And at this point in time, Osborne heads off and Hufnagel heads over to Tony Vincent's Lady Jane's strip club. So over the next half an hour, JP Morgan have now processed that transaction for $149.9 million. But there's also a few other warning signs here. So for a start, that sort of type of transaction, that size, should never really happen on a lead up to a public holiday. It's very unusual. There's also a date problem in that the fax they sent through with the transfer has been dated November 2003. So it's not even today's date. And that's just like a basic error that they've made. There's also been no advance notice. Often something unusual like this, there's other processes through the staff of both sides of JP Morgan and SSGA where there'd be a lead up and some sort of advance notice of a big transfer and a big trade that potentially is coming through. And the other thing that's not standard is these are going to overseas accounts. A lot of the times these sort of dollar amounts would either be going out to fund managers or other people that are usual parties that they have common dealings with and that you'd almost recognize the account holders. But some of these accounts have got very non-standard account names and some of them are to gambling related accounts in Hong Kong. So there's red flags all over it and basically it looks like Greg Burscher is the one that signed off on it internally and therefore he's also just circumvented any of the processes that someone normally would be looking at. And for the breakdown of the accounts, we've got $30.5 million going through to one of the Hong Kong accounts, which is going to be used later on for their gambling. We've got $20.6 million, which is going to an account based in Macau. We've got $26.7 million going to the Swiss bank account. And then we've got $71.9 million going to the Greek account. By 3:30, the transfers are done. It looks like it's all worked. And back at Lady Jane's, Tony Vincent and crew would be starting to think like they have hit the jackpot. But what Tony Vincent doesn't know is that by later that evening, some of the cracks are going to start to show and all started because of a man called Demetrius. So this is now 10:30 p.m. Sydney time and in Athens, it's around 3:30 p.m. And the bank manager for Lakey Bank in Athens, Demetrius Papadopoulos, is reviewing all the transactions for the day. And he's just seen $71.9 million come through into an account for Georgios Styliano. Papadopoulos supposedly knew Styliano personally and knew that he definitely didn't have $71 million. And he's thinking this is now an impossible transaction and that there's an error. But he's also noticed one other thing. The transfer has come into a Georgios Styliano Ltd. And that's unusual because it's a personal account, not a business account. So what does he do? He calls up Georgios. Georgios, of course, claims that it's come in from his business partner in Australia. And how can he access it? But unfortunately, Demetrios was a little bit better at his internal controls than the staff at JPMorgan, because he's now said, we can't actually clear these funds because of the LTD. And until there's a discrepancy that's been resolved, we can't get you the funds. And the unsuspecting Demetrios has actually started the little snowball that's going to cause the avalanche and break the whole heist for Tony Vincent. So next, Papadopoulos sends a fax back to JPMorgan in Sydney, asking them to resend the fax over with the account name corrected. But unfortunately for JPMorgan, that fax is now going to sit on their fax machine for 5 days without being seen. Supposedly, Georgios called Tony Vincent directly and tells him about the LTD issue with the Greek account and the $71.9 million that he cannot access. And Tony Vincent's going to bring in his crisis team, Dallas Fitzgerald, Mr. Pink, as well as Matthew Terrio, who helped set up the Greek account. And they're going to have to work out what they're going to do about it. They know they have to wait till Monday to set another fax to correct the error, and that would be suspicious if they tried to hack in to that line and send it on a day which otherwise would be a public holiday. So they decide to wait to the Monday before sending Osborne and Huffnagel back to send a new fax correcting the error, but also potentially exposing themselves to have to redo the same exact fraud twice. That night, Leon Kuris also calls Richard Kurland to see if his Swiss bank account has received any money in it. Richard Kurland then calls his bank, BCV, in Lausanne, and a staffer tells him he's now got $26.7 million in his account. Now, Kuris has told Kurland that the money has come in from an investor, and the investor's name is Dallas O'Hara, which is actually Dallas Fitzgerald. And this person's been introduced to him by his old friend Alexander Roisman. Kuris gives instructions to Kurland to transfer these funds off immediately to another account across the globe in New York. So at this point in time, Vincent knows they've got an issue with the Greek account. They think they might have the Swiss account money cleared, and they've also got the Hong Kong accounts with over $50 million sitting in them. But then on the 25th of December, Christmas Day, Arkady Drisner, the international mystery man, gets on a plane out of Sydney and he's never seen again. I suspect that was always the plan, that he was going to leave that day. And I suspect he was going over to the countries where he needed to withdraw money from to then move them on to their next location. On Christmas Day as well, we've now got problems with the Swiss account. Richard Kurland gets a call from the bank, the BCV, asking, where's this money come from? Why is it into an account which has been dormant for 10 years and literally only had $90 in it? Who is Dallas O'Hara that he's wanting to transfer the money out to? What's the legitimate business purposes for the money? And why are you trying to suddenly move money out that you just received in automatically out to another account? So Kurland's told the story that he's got this money in because it's for a takeover bid for a company of which he can't name. But the Swiss bank then says to Richard Kurland, you need to come here directly in person if you want to take this money out. Now, Kurland's in Australia in the Blue Mountains, and he's going to take days before he can get there to then go and do that transaction. But at this point in time, Tony Vincent knows that he's got two people headed over towards Hong Kong and try to access the $50 million in those accounts. They've got detailed instructions of how they're going to get money out through Macau and through the gambling industry. And the plan's pretty simple. The money's been transferred into an account with a gambling cruise operation. They're going to then collect chips for that amount. They're going to be able to gamble. Then they can collect their clean receipt, take it back to Macau and collect cash back at the Grand Lisboa Casino. Pretty basic money laundering, but to them, it's going to be effective. Now we go to Monday, December 29. We're back at the JPMorgan office in Sydney, and staff have returned back after the holidays. They get back. The first thing they see is a fax from Demetrios Papadopoulos and the Greek bank suggesting that the transaction for $71.9 million has an error and they needed to resend the instructions. So they then check the account for the Commonwealth Superannuation Scheme and they find it's overdrawn by $150 million. Now this would seem impossible, so we've got a massive problem. They're going to be panicking like you wouldn't believe. They then say, well, let's go out and find the original instruction that was sent transferring this money out. And they can't find it. And at this point, I wonder if Greg Boucher destroyed those fax instructions so they couldn't be found, and also to, again, try to remove the evidence of anything connecting him and the fact that he was the one that entered the instructions possibly into the Treasury system and also took the call from SSGA. So at this point, they then call the contact at SSGA, State Street, who's Craig Slater. And they get on the phone to Craig and they ask him to verify the transactions that he sent over on Christmas Eve. And what does he say? I didn't send any instruction. And it's impossible. I never authorized such a transaction. But remember, the phone calls are recorded. So they bring out the phone recordings and they can play it back to the real Craig Slater. And that he then says, that's not my voice. State Street now can also check to see what phone calls they've got recordings of. And they confirm that they had no recording whatsoever of anything from their office on the 24th of December. And now they all know that there's been a massive heist and elaborate fraud committed. So at this point, if you're JPMorgan, you need to stop those transactions. They've already left the bank 5 days ago, but at this point in time, they've got to race against time. They bring in the police straight away. The police come in from the office at the Rocks, which is pretty close by, and they've got crisis meetings with State Street, JPMorgan, the police, and also trying to work out how they can contact all these overseas banks and get them to freeze the accounts of where this money has been sent to. And here's the crazier thing. Remember Tony Vincent's plan to resend the fax? Huffnagel and Osborne are back at the Telstra exchange again on that same morning, trying to resend the fax instruction to correct the name and remove the LTD. They just don't know at this point in time it's too late and that the scam's already been uncovered. So on December 29 in Hong Kong now, we've got Alexander Roisman on a floating casino boat called the Captain Omar III, which goes from Hong Kong, and he's there along with Jian Ping Wong. And that leaves from the ocean terminal in Hong Kong. And it's actually on its maiden voyage as a gambling operation. It's previously been sailing around the Caribbean. And so the reason why this might have been used for money laundering is because, well, firstly, the gambling operation goes out into international waters. So you're now in no jurisdiction of any country. You then can convert your chips later on back to cash. So there's no electronic trail of where these funds have come through. Also, the large amount of transactions of the gambling, people that would have been doing gambling of multi-million dollars, is possibly not going to arouse suspicion, they think, of them and having these tens of millions of dollars that they're trying to use. So on that evening, when the boat's out in the ocean, Roisman's out there at the baccarat tables with Jian Ping Wong, who is the gambler. Now, they are pictured on security cameras while they're at their baccarat tables. And that evidence later on is going to be a massive win for the police. And so whilst the ship's out in the South China Sea and they're gambling away, Wong, who's a professional gambler, he gets a bit carried away. And whilst you're supposed to gamble a certain amount so that they can just move through their chips, he keeps making bigger and bigger bets. And by the next morning, he's lost $3.4 million on the baccarat tables. But to them, they've still got $27 million worth of chips that they can convert. So in the bigger scheme of things, it's not going to make or break the operation. So the next morning, when the ship arrives back at the ocean terminal in Hong Kong, who's waiting for them there? Mr. Pink, Dallas Fitzgerald. And they've now got the chips. They've now got to get over to Macau to cash this in. And they're going to go to the Casino Lisboa. It's a high-speed ferry they're going to catch, and it takes about an hour to get there. And I did that personally myself back in about 2009, caught that ferry. So Roisman has now got the receipt. They're at the cashier cage in the casino and trying to convert it back to cash. And they get this horrific news back that their account has been frozen and they cannot process the request. At this point in time, Dallas Fitzgerald demands the cashier try it again. They find the same thing. Now Fitzgerald this time is going to go ballistic. So Fitzgerald now immediately gets back on the ferry, goes back to the Hong Kong business district and tries to go to the Hong Kong bank with the other funds in the other account. And he finds that's been frozen as well. So he makes a phone call back to Sydney to Jamie Vincent, one of the inside circle and the son of Tony Vincent. And remember, the police were recording all of these phone calls from Jamie Vincent. So we have the whole transcript of what Mr. Pink said to Jamie Vincent. Here it is. And my favourite line here is Mr. Pink saying, "Figure out what happened. We're stuck in effing Macau with nothing." And then Jamie Vincent calls him back a few minutes later and says, "It's all kind of effed." So now they know they're cooked, but they don't know why. So now let's recap what's happened to these 4 accounts of $150 million. In Greece, we've got $71.9 million frozen because the person put an LTD on the transaction instruction that they shouldn't have. In Switzerland, we've got $26.7 million frozen because Richard Curlin needed to appear in person to authorize the instruction. In Hong Kong and Macau, we've got all the funds frozen under a court order that somehow JPMorgan's been able to pull off within a couple of days. And in addition to that, they lost $3.4 million just gambling at Baccarat. So they haven't even been able to access a single dollar out of the $150 million heist. So I promised before I'll cover the 11 dumb things they did in this crime. Number 1, the whole thing was planned when Tony Vincent and some of his crew were under constant phone call surveillance. So the whole thing was picked up in planning, and the only reason it even happened is because the police never cottoned on to the fact that they were talking about doing another massive crime. The second one is Arkady Drisner. When he came into Australia, he had hard copies of the JPMorgan instructions with all the handwritten notes about what needed to be on there. And again, if he just kept digital copies or not had them as hard copy, then later on, when the police are piecing the things together, they wouldn't have these as evidence that they'd be able to use against the gang. The third one is the fax instruction of the transactions was dated in November. In some ways, JPMorgan should have seen that and rejected it immediately if it wasn't for the fact that potentially the inside man was the only person that saw those instructions. But that as just a basic, they got the date wrong. The fourth one is when they sent the fax, only 1 of the 5 pages even went through. However they planned to send this fax through, it didn't actually even work, and 4 out of the 5 pages had to be sent from just a generic fax line. Again, that could have tripped them up. It didn't, but it should have. The next one is using the swipe card to get access to the Telstra exchange, because that was always going to be recorded and be accessible later on to find out who went in and when. And even on that day, the fact that there was renovations going on, they probably didn't know about before they went there. And if they went through the main entrance during that time, they may not have even had to have used the swipe card. And the biggie was the Greek account. Someone put an LTD on the end of a name from a personal bank account name, thinking it probably sounded more corporate, but it was actually the thing that stopped that bank clearing those funds. It shows that they just didn't really understand what the LTD would actually mean, or the difference between personal and business accounts and what sort of checks that the other banks might be still doing. And in relation to the Hong Kong money, potentially they just didn't move it out fast enough. They needed to be on the ground, being able to transfer that money out within 24 hours. But they waited a couple of days, and they probably timed it with the Captain Omar trip where they thought they had that whole holiday break and that they would be safe, but they didn't plan it quick enough. Next one was Greg Boucher made a massive mistake in not realizing the implications of the recorded lines, because it would come back to him personally. If he was the inside man handing off instructions, he couldn't have done it in a way where he was also the one dealing with the exact transaction on the day, because he would have known they're going to come back and work out who sent the transaction, who did the callback, who processed it in the system, and all of that stuff is logged on the system and recorded on the phone calls. Another one for Greg Boucher is he gave State Street's contact person as Craig Slater. They needed to show that the call came through from a Craig Slater, when the callback then could show at least it came through from someone that sounded like it was legitimate, and perhaps that would have cleared Greg. But the fact that they gave the name of someone who was on leave that day and wasn't even working meant that that was going to come unstuck very, very fast. And here's a third one for Greg Boucher. is that he put his identifiable handwriting on those instructions for JP Morgan and then handed it off to potentially Gary Peterson. He didn't know perhaps where it was going to go. He didn't know that multiple people would end up having copies of it. We'll find out more about who ended up with those. But his handwriting ties him back to the event, and he never should have done that. And the 11th dumb mistake really was they went too big. $150 million was crazy. If they did this for maybe $5 million, just to go to maybe one, if not two accounts overseas, maybe they would have had a slightly better chance. But going for such a massive amount was probably the biggest mistake they made. That was just going to be easier for JP Morgan to act faster and with more intent to then go and get those court orders to freeze the overseas accounts, because they did that remarkably fast, and they did it because there was so much money involved. So I mentioned at the start that I worked at JP Morgan and in this very area. So I'll give you a bit more background to that. So I went there in late 2006, so a little bit less than 3 years after this crime happened. And I was ultimately the manager of the area which dealt with all the Treasury transactions every day, which meant that I was the one that was actually signing off on what my team had processed for that day for the daily cutoffs. And I would be signing off on tens of millions of dollars going out every single day. And often you'd find you'd have enormous amount of these transactions, but the amount that would be in the multi-millions was probably in the smaller numbers. So something like this would absolutely stand out like a sore thumb. But it's also that the timing of when they did this really kind of was quite ingenious, doing it on Christmas Eve. So when I went there in 2006, it wasn't really I had never heard about the case before. But in the lead up to December 2006, and I usually always worked over the Christmas breaks, I remember specifically people saying, you've got to be careful of transactions around now because of the thing that's happened before. And at that point I asked, well, what happened before? What is it? And what was referenced was that there was a transaction for $20 million that was fraudulent, that someone internally had tried to send out to another third party. So even at that point in time, it wasn't common knowledge in the bank at all of the staff that were there at that point in time that this mega $150 million crime had happened. I only heard about it years later. But the $20 million one sounded vastly different, and the detail and the means behind it certainly wasn't known by many people that work there. And really that sort of area, it does turn over staff quite a lot. I imagine some of the people that were there at the time were probably moved on out or booted out the door. But some of the controls that were there when I came in, I think had already been beefed up to combat some of the requirements for having dual signatories, perhaps the callback processes more independently verifiable. And that's certainly the experience that I saw. Looking at this case though, I do find it very strange that a second person must have seen it on that day. And I really can't understand how that money transfer happened without a second person's signature, because Greg Bouchier didn't fake a second person's signature. So it definitely had one. But I think what happened was, again, it was that whole, it's the end of the day, there's a half an hour deadline before all the markets for cash close, and the person signing off on it probably didn't check it, to be honest. And if that's the case, that's when Greg Bouchier was able to say, I've checked these already, I've done it, all looks good, and someone else just got their signature on it and probably didn't even see all the items that were on there, let alone what they should have been looking for, which was account names and dollar amounts. And something like the accounts they sent it to, there's some individual personal names that are on these accounts. And that is just abnormal to send for these types of transactions. Because for large amounts sending out through from a superannuation fund like this, these amounts are typically going out to other external fund managers. So they're putting off amounts, even if it was to an overseas fund manager, the names will sound like a fund manager, not like an individual person. So individuals aren't getting $20+ million sent out to them. It's just crazy to think about that. But the other thing at the time was, the big thing was really the anti-money laundering and the rules that were internalized and the controls was very much about not sending funds to certain countries or organizations which were on terrorist watch lists. So all the controls about trying to pick up where these funds are going to wasn't really trying to pick up fraud to just a independently set up account. It was trying to prevent any money going out to certain countries that were known for harboring terrorism, or for organizations that were in any way linked to it. And they were more likely system controls that wouldn't even allow that to even go out, whereas these going out to a Swiss account, Hong Kong accounts, Greek accounts, that's not going to be picked up by the system and blocked. Another thing to keep in mind is when you've got transactions moving through like this, you have other people in the organizations that will be aware of large-scale events. So for example, if the trustee was moving $100 million from one fund manager and positioning over to another fund manager, these are things that an account manager, a relationship manager would all know about. They'll be talking about it and potentially sending internal instructions and updates on, so that you wouldn't just be blindly receiving these things. There's a lot of internal steps that would be happening potentially in the lead up to it that if you're seeing it and been asked to approve it, you should be saying, well, I should know something about this already. And if not, you can then go back and check with the relationship manager to have yet another person confirm that this is correct. Because the thing that you're really trying to stop against is that if something for $2 million was entered incorrectly by the person processing it as $20 million, you're actually trying to pick up that sort of stuff, that the amounts just being too high sounded incorrect, and you then want to go and confirm independently why. My other inside knowledge here is why these accounts were allowed to go into such a large overdraft and for those funds to even go out. Because often that's going to be like there's either a certain line of credit where it could happen, but to have $150 million, which was allowed by the system to be sent out, meaning that therefore there must have been a limit of at least that amount to be overdrawn for a day. So it's almost unbelievable to me that there's not some sort of system control that it would have been existed at that time to prevent that account going into overdraft by such a massive amount. There weren't other funds that you would have sitting in there that would have compensated for it to not send that into overdraft. So in some ways, I think probably the internal advice from Greg Busher of how to do it, I wonder if he knew the amount of money that they were going to do. Because otherwise, from the outset, if he would have known something about it, I would have thought he would have tried to say that amount might not pass through. But on the day, it's probably then too late, and he's just been asked to do a callback and sign off on it, and he's probably stuck at that point in time. My last question I want to ask is, could this be done today? Is this repeatable as a fraud case in today's technology and today's setup? And we're going to answer that at the end of the video. So I talked before about the police being called straight in on Monday, but now let's jump into the investigation phase and talking about that in detail. Because this quickly goes over in January 2004 to the Australian Federal Police, AFP. And they're going to launch what they're going to call Operation Riparian. Not sure if that's pronounced right, but we'll call it Operation Riparian. This is led by Detective Sergeant Brad Kerwan, and he's 33 years old, and he's only been at the AFP for 2 years. And this is going to be the most complex financial crime in Australian history, let's keep in mind. He's spent the last 14 years of experience in sort of remote and regional outback communities, and he doesn't exactly have the skills to be involved in a crime of this sort. His deputy is Scott Miller, who's 36 years old, and he previously, before joining the police, worked for Telstra for 13 years and the finance sector. And this experience is going to be quite useful for them as a team. At the biggest, they reached a team of about 14 members of the AFP investigating this case. But I wonder, why did they put such an inexperienced detective on this? And I find that quite baffling. Now, let's keep in mind, the initial evidence they've got to go on is a fax, which has been sent by the Telstra exchange around the corner, and an unknown voice on that, which is pretending to be State Street's Craig Slater, saying, "How you going, mate? Not too bad," as he confirms the instructions. The reason why that bit's important is because those words are going to be helpful later on. But Detective Kerwin's got a big challenge. This is an international case. There's 4 countries involved. There's also highly technical complexity around how it's been carried out through the international banking networks. And you've also potentially got sophistication in that in terms of who could be behind it. Plus also, you need to try to gather evidence and form a legal case and do it in a way where there's a lot of pressure on because of the size of the actual crime in dollar terms. But the fraud has got 2 sides. You've got the side with the actual fraud of getting the money out from JPMorgan, and then you've got the laundering of that money between these 4 other accounts. Now, Kerwin and Miller are going to take a month before they get their first breakthrough. And the breakthrough is that JPMorgan's Treasury officer, Greg Berkshire, took the call from the fraudsters, and JPMorgan's records show that he did not make the compulsory callback to the State Street advisors. And when police check his personal phone records, they find a connection. He's a family friend of Gary Peterson, aka Fat Bastard. And they know that from phone intercepts on another investigation via Strikeforce Westbank, that Peterson is a close associate of both Dallas Fitzgerald, Mr. Pink, and Tony Vincent. And that Strikeforce is a joint investigation between the New South Wales Crime Commission and New South Wales Police, who suspect the group was involved in large-scale drug distribution and money laundering. And then they go back and find out that on December the 24th, the Strikeforce were listening into phone calls, and they had heard Tony Vincent having panicked phone calls about cash transfers. And they interpreted that at the time as being in relation to the importation of drugs, not knowing that it was about the heist. So then they go to the phone intercepts of Gary Peterson, and what do they find? They hear a voice that says, "How you going, mate? Not too bad?" And guess what? It's Ernst Huffnall. Police don't know that just yet. But they have more phone intercepts where they hear the same series of words that they heard on that phone line to JPMorgan. So now they've found the voice of who's made the calls on the heist. And through their intercepted calls, they know that it's back to Ernst Huffnall making them. So they then look through Huffnall's records and they find that he's been calling another guy Barry Osborne. And now Detective Miller recognizes that is a Telstra guy, because the detective used to work at Telstra. And the Telstra exchange around the corner from JPMorgan was one of the first spots they go and visit, the Daly Street exchange. And they're going to go and try to find out how could a fraudulent fax been sent from that exchange to JPMorgan. And part of that investigation they find is on the day, someone used their swipe card to go through the side door, Barry Osborne. And they've got a record of him at 12:47 of entering that door. And he had no reason to be there because he didn't work at that exchange. He worked at the Waverley Depot, and he also was on a day off. So Huffnall's voice has been heard not only on the call to JPMorgan and also the other intercepts they've been doing as part of the drug trafficking. They've also heard him on the phone call to international co-conspirators discussing the fraud. So now the detectives, Kerwin and Miller, they're reconstructing the key movements of people in the gang back to the bank heist. And they go back through surveillance records and they discover at that point that Customs had made secretly a copy of a bag owned by a mysterious figure who was suspected of being an international drug trafficker, Arkady Drisner. And that was when he went through Customs at Sydney Airport. Drisner turned up on intercepted calls with Tony Vincent back in May 2003. And in his September visit back to Australia, the customs officers copied everything they found in his bag. And amongst those documents were faxes on JPMorgan letterhead relating to foreign currency bank accounts. There was also handwritten notes on them about how to transfer money around the world. And the notes had some of the same dates identifying public holidays in Australia and overseas. So now we've got 2 breakthroughs. We've got the handwriting of the JPMorgan faxes relating to Greg Berkshire, who they think could be the insider. They've got footage from the search of Dallas Fitzgerald's apartment from another investigation where those same JPMorgan documents were photographed lying on his table, and they've also got Berkshire's handwriting on the same ones. And it's now March 2004 that the AFP are starting to question members of the heist gang. And so at that point in time, they know that both the cops are onto them and as well that they've got detailed information about potentially how they did it. So as part of the investigation now, they start putting together the evidence. And they've got casino security footage from Hong Kong, from the Captain Omar III, and they've also got gambling receipts that they've taken in. For the Swiss account, they've got the bank transaction records, and they've also got the account access logs of who's gone into them. In Greece, they've got the banking communications, and they've got the customer verification attempts into those accounts. And in Macau, they've got the casino transaction records and the surveillance records of when they went to try to cash in the chips. Next in the search, they go and look at Tony Vincent and they search his properties and they find the same JPMorgan faxes with Greg Bushier's handwriting in Tony Vincent's possession, as well as all the other details around account setups, transfer of monies across to international accounts, and also comms records for international co-conspirators. Now, after the investigation has gone through all the detailed information gathering that they needed, they can start making some arrests. But it's going to take until August 2005, and there's going to be 6 of them arrested in that first wave of things. And they're going to make an appearance all under the charge of conspiracy to money launder. And that's going to be an appearance in Sydney's Central Local Court. The first 4 are Richard Kurland, Leon Couris, Alexander Roisman, and Mr. Pink, Dallas Fitzgerald. All 4 of these are granted bail after this court appearance. The next 2, Jian Ping Wong and Jian Hua Chen, are also remanded in custody at that point in time though. But the outcome of the $150 million at this point in time is that police have recovered $147 million. So that's gone back to where it came from, but the missing $3 million from the gambling, that at this point in time has not. But the police make a note at this time that they've got footage of Roisman and Jian Ping Wong gambling at the Captain Omar III baccarat tables. And whilst the bail I mentioned before for 3 of the people was $10,000, the 4th one, Dallas Fitzgerald, was on a $20,000 bail. And the reason why is because the Crown's case was that he was the person that organised all the transactions. They think that he organised the whole thing on behalf of Tony Vincent. Now we skip forward to October 2005. We've got some more arrests. Greg Bushier, who at this time has already left JPMorgan, not surprisingly, but the police are now claiming that he had been assisting the syndicate with providing them internal faxes and documents with his handwriting found on them, and for some reason he actually represented himself at that court hearing. The 2 others that were arrested were Barry Osborne, who at that point in time was suspended from Telstra on full pay, as well as Ernst Huffnell. The bizarre story here is the 3 of them were put into the back of a police van, and whilst they're sitting there, Greg Bushier, looking at those 2, he has no idea who they are. He has no idea they're involved in this crime. He has no idea that they sent the fax to him, and he has no idea that Ernst Huffnell was the one on the phone call to him making that confirmation. He was completely in the dark. And these court cases, they take a long time. We're now almost 2 years later. It's now July 2007. The committal proceedings now against 12 of the members have now started in Sydney's Central Local Court. So we've got Kurland, Couris, Roisman, Fitzgerald, Wong, Chen. We've then got Bushier, Osborne, Huffnagel, and then also Tony Vincent, Gary Peterson, and 1 other that's also charged as part of these 12. Couldn't find the name of that. I think it's either Matthew Theriault or Jamie Vincent though. And the prosecutor at this point in time is alleging that Tony Vincent was the brainchild behind the heist. The first sentencing though doesn't happen until another 1.5 years later, December 2008, and the court sentencing for 3 members. We've got Greg Bushier, received 5 years, 2.5 years non-parole, but it's to be served in protective custody because he's got a police officer as a relative, and he's also got a relative who's in the Department of Public Prosecution. Didn't stop him from doing the crime, but he's now going to go into protective custody. Barry Osborne then gets 5 years as well, with 3 years non-parole, and Ernst Huffnagel also gets 5 years, 3 years non-parole. And the judge said each of these provided an important but limited role in the conspiracy. They had nothing to do with the initial planning, nor were they at the level of an organizer of the crime. And there was no evidence ever mentioned about what these men were expected to receive as part of their role. The only thing we know is that Osborne supposedly told his parole officer that he expected to get the deposit for a home out of it. And if you go back to 2003 in Sydney house prices, my guess is it's either 50 grand or 100 grand that these guys were promised to do their very limited specific role. And I'll say 100 grand maximum, but nothing more than that. But as part of the sentencing, the judge has made some crazy comments about misunderstanding the role of Tony Vincent, who had been sentenced earlier in that year, saying he was actually a controller, he was an organizer, and he played a significant role more so than the others did. So what had happened is Tony Vincent was already serving 6 years for drug supply at that point in time. And he then pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in relation to the heist. And he was given a 3-year sentence for his role in this heist. And for some bizarre reason, the prosecution agreed with the defense back early in 2008 that Tony Vincent didn't even know the full scope of the whole fraud and therefore agreed to these lesser charges. But because he's in prison already for the 6 years and the sentences are served concurrently, he's not going to serve an extra single day for being the sole originator and ringleader behind this whole heist. But the even crazier thing is, Tony Vincent's name was then suppressed and couldn't be published as being what the judge suspected was the ringleader behind it. The judge also said at the same time that one of the main leaders of it had already left the country, and they were probably referring to Arkady Drisner at that point in time. So now we go forward more than a year again, February 2010, and now we have Alexander Roisman, who's sentenced to 5.5 years in jail for dealing in the proceeds of crime. But hang on, he's going to appeal that, and let's find out what happens. And then in July 2010, Leon Kuris, who was also probably convicted previous year, had an appeal along with Roisman overturned, and they are now scot-free. They've been charged with conspiring to launder money, but they won their appeal because they've been deemed as being reckless to the fact that the money was the proceeds of crime, and therefore they were innocent. The prosecution then appealed that all the way to the High Court, and unbelievably, they lost. The High Court ruled that Richard Kurland agreed to the proposal from Kuris at the behest of a third party. They didn't name who, wonder if it was Tony Vincent, that his Swiss bank account could be used. And that whilst they agreed for their overseas accounts to be used to transfer the funds to, the police could not prove that they knew where the money came from or that the funds were derived from fraudulent activity. The next convictions were Jamie Vincent, who was convicted for 20 months, and at that point in time had only just come out of jail after serving 5 years for drug offences. Jianping Wang, convicted for 6.5 years sentence, pretty steep. Matthew Theriault, who organised the Greek account, had his charges dropped, and then Jianhua Chen was convicted and received a 3.5 year sentence for helping to set up one of the Hong Kong accounts. So I know what you're thinking. What happened to Mr. Pink? Well, let's fast forward, May 2011. The last man standing is Mr. Pink. Now, his argument to the court was that he was just a kid who was ignorant to what was actually happening around him, and he had no idea that he was even helping set up Tony Vincent for the crime. They had evidence that he travelled to Amsterdam at one stage in relation to this case, and his argument was that he only went there to source girls for the Lady Jane's Club. So why was he in Hong Kong? He thought he was there to supervise Tony Vincent's investment in an internet gaming business. And why is he called Mr. Pink? His argument was he just liked pink. His whole bedroom was pink, apparently. But the jury found him guilty of his part in trying to launder $20 million of the stolen money only. And he would then later on receive a sentence in November that year to a 3-year term. So for your bingo card of all the sentences and who got caught and who didn't get caught, here's a big summary I've put together showing all the different people. And out of the 14 men involved, 9 of them received convictions and jail terms. And it's fascinating to see that some of the biggest jail terms went to those that were not even in the circle of trust. So they played a very segmented role. And unfortunately, that's probably a sign of a very successful criminal organization where the people that are doing the end result, that are committing the biggest crimes, have a gap between them and the organizers. And I think this is also a pretty poor reflection on the AFP and the prosecutors, that they didn't hold the people that were the organizers really to account here. And they had some convictions at the lower levels where there was perhaps more evidence, but they really didn't manage to get successful prosecutions, especially for Tony Vincent. That's quite unbelievable that he got a 3-year term, served concurrently, and basically didn't do an extra day in prison for this whole crime. I've also got Felix Lyle on here, really for the fact that he probably would have been at some point involved, but he never came up as one of the organisers. He's certainly linked to knowing many of the people on here, but not someone that we've heard mentioned with any evidence against him. And let's not forget, there's one other loser in this case, and that's actually JPMorgan itself. And that's because out of the money that was lost and gambled away, which was $3.4 million, that money, as far as I can tell, was never recovered and had to be reimbursed directly by JPMorgan back to the Commonwealth Superannuation Scheme. So JPMorgan lost out by the $3 million and probably fought in courts to try to get that back, but I couldn't find any evidence that they were actually successful with that. And so why is this case so unknown? This is the third biggest heist of money I could find from a bank in history. And even internally, working directly in JPMorgan myself, it was only referred to at that point in time as a $20 million crime. And that was before a lot of the court cases would happen later on where the convictions were known and published. But I think part of what this has got to do with it is the area within JPMorgan that this was done through was their custody business. And the whole definition of custody is the safeguarding of assets. So basically it was a failure of the whole operation of that to secure money. And I suspect that JPMorgan, for every ounce of what they could do to prevent this case becoming more well known, publicized, to get attention, that they did everything in their power to keep this under wraps and to not allow information to get out at all wherever they could control it. Because really this is the sort of thing that destroys credibility as a custodian, a safeguard of assets, when you have such a massive fraud perpetrated on your business. And the last question, could the heist be done today? Well, I think a lot's changed since then. In some ways, the transaction of instructions, for example, would be done via more secure portals where just intercepting a fax line couldn't really just be enough to do it, I don't think. User credentials that are systemically checked and verified is a lot more prevalent and would be hard to circumvent that in the same way that this crime was done. It would also really need, I think, a level of cyber hacking to be able to perpetrate this rather than the way that they were doing it by trying to intercept. But the other change, I think, these days is where the money was then sent off to other accounts. I think that might actually be easier today than it was back then, because I think these days the attempt to send these out and quickly convert this into cryptocurrencies would probably be the way that they would have done it rather than use the methods they had where they were just trying to pass it between an account to another account to another account until it seemed like it was being cleaned. So if you'd like to read even more and capture back some more information that I haven't covered in this video, there's a link down below to the PDF which I've compiled everything that I've researched about it and other information that you're going to find a good read, hopefully. But it wouldn't be complete without just doing a final epilogue of what happened to a couple of the people that were involved in this case. And the first one is my favorite, Mr. Pink, Dallas Fitzgerald. And his background and what happened afterwards are both all fascinating. In 2002, before this case, he and his father, Felix Lyle, were the subject of a murder plot from a guy called Anthony Parrish, who had hired an assassin to take them both out. But then the assassin shot the wrong guy by mistake 3 times, who luckily survived. But then fast forward in 2006, keep in mind, whilst this whole investigation is all still happening, Felix Lyle and Dallas Fitzgerald have a feud with a guy called Rodney Hooks Monk from the Bandidos bikie gang. And this is about the theft of millions of dollars of drugs from a guy called Milad Sand, who's then later found murdered. And then Dallas gets kidnapped himself, and the police suspect that was as a retaliation from Hooks over the role of the stolen drugs. And all that while Dallas is on bail in relation to the JPMorgan heist. But he's a busy guy, and at some stage Dallas is rumoured to be promoted to the National Sergeant-at-Arms of the Hells Angels. But let's fast forward to 2016, and there's another guy, Pascal Barbaro, who gets murdered. He's an associate of Mr. Pink, Dallas Fitzgerald, and sometime after November, Dallas leaves Australia and heads over to Russia, never to return to Australia. But what about Felix Lyle, Dallas's dad? His story gets even more colourful. He was the president of the Bandidos up until 2002 when he got kicked out. Then at some point later on becomes the Sydney chapter boss of the Hells Angels. Around 2005, he's supposedly the owner or operator of the Gas nightclub in Haymarket, Sydney, which then gets shot up in a gang attack in August 2006. In 2012, he's convicted of an attempted fraud of more than $2.1 million. He's accused with another guy, Terence Reddy, of creating false financial documents in the names of directors and the staff, of which are then used to apply for loans, and Lyle ends up with some of that money. And that crime happened over 2005 to 2007, ironically after his son is on bail already for the JPMorgan financial crime. And in 2012, he's also charged with trying to extort $120,000 from a luxury car dealer, Terry Mullins. And these charges are then later dropped. But by 2012, unfortunately, he's a bankrupt. He's lost his car license and he needs to be chauffeur driven around Sydney in his famous red Bentley. 2013, he's then jailed for fraud and drug offences. But he's still busy because in March 2013, he's arrested over his role in an attempt to supply 50 black market Glock pistols with a whole bunch of other people from the Hells Angels. But those charges are then later dropped as well. But we've got some good news. 4 years later, he's served his jail term. February 2017, he's released from prison. But bad news, he's then deported to New Zealand. And then he somehow ends up in the Philippines after a while. More recent times, he then left and went over to Russia in 2023 for cancer treatment. And he was over there living with his son, Mr. Pink, Dallas Fitzgerald. So there's somewhat of a family reunion. And then sometime around August 2023, Felix Lyle dies in Russia, aged 66. And the last recap is Matthew Theriault, organising of the Greek account, remember, in the heist. Now, he had his charges dropped in 2009. And at the same year, he took up sport fishing. He started a business, Goa Sports Fishing, which is a fishing charter company in India. But Matthew's got an older brother called Maurice Theriault. And his story is maybe the craziest of the whole group. Maurice has an interest in a financial planning company called Solutions Wealth Strategies. And that reportedly has several close ties to the people behind Trio Capital. Now, around 2009, Trio Capital had collapsed and was the largest theft of a superannuation money in Australian history, a total of $176 million, of which about $123 million was funneled offshore, never to be seen again. And he was involved along with, guess who? Felix Lyle, with a failed King's Cross hotel development deal gone wrong. The Hampton Court Hotel at Bayswater Road, King's Cross. Now in 2008, they were sued for over $1 million. They lost, and they were both bankrupted by the court action in March 2009. But for Maurice, unfortunately, this is his second bankruptcy in the last 10 years. And he still owes money in relation to the financial business. So he goes and borrows $150,000 from a loan shark called Michael McGurk. And he's a very well-known guy in Australian crime history. Now he borrows the money for 2 months, but unfortunately he didn't repay it. And we think that the loan is to fund something to do with the financial planning business, which then later on would go into liquidation. The loan has penalty payments of an astronomical $50,000 per week. So by June, he now owes McGurk $500,000, and McGurk wants his money back. But this gets even crazier, because less than 3 months later, McGurk was executed at his Cremorne home on the 30th September 2009. And guess what? Maurice hadn't repaid his loan by then. If you're a new CFO, aspiring to be one, or just like hearing crazy financial stories like this one, I've got more content designed for you, like this one up here. And consider subscribing to get more real-life CFO experiences and tips to help you in your financial career. Bye for now.